I watched my fiancée laugh as she pulverized years of my life into dust. But the real nightmare began when her SUV plowed through my house at 2 a.m. She's in handcuffs now, screaming that I'm the monster, but she has no idea I caught every single second of her terrifying secret on camera. What the judge saw next is the only reason I'm still alive to tell this story. I get paid to stop disasters before they happen, but I totally missed the one sleeping right next to me for over a year. I'm a construction scheduler, which basically means I'm the guy who lives and breathes blueprints, timelines, and worst-case scenarios. My entire professional life is built around looking at a massive, chaotic construction site and figuring out exactly where things are going to fall apart before a single shovel hits the dirt. I see the delays, the budget overruns, and the structural failures months in advance. You'd think that kind of hyper-awareness would carry over into my personal life, right? You'd think a guy who spends 40 hours a week spotting red flags on multi-million-dollar projects would be able to see an emotional train wreck coming from a mile away. But that's the thing about being in love. It doesn't just blind you. It rewrites your internal software until you're ignoring every warning light on the dashboard. I thought I was building a solid foundation with my dream woman, but it turns out I was just signing up for a front-row seat to my own destruction. I wasn't building a home. I was unknowingly helping Emma set the charges for a controlled demolition of everything I'd worked for since college. I'm 33, I live in a decent spot in North Carolina, and I've always been the steady one. My cousin Damon, who runs one of the contractor crews I work with, always calls me the anchor because nothing seems to shake me. I like my life organized. I like my spreadsheets. I like taking my golden retriever Frodo on long trail walks. And I like coming home to a house that feels like a sanctuary. Then Emma walked in, and for a while I really thought I'd finally found the person to share that sanctuary with. We met at a mutual friend's dinner on a night when I almost didn't go. I was tired. I had a deadline looming, but I figured one beer wouldn't kill me. Emma arrived late, and the second she stepped through the door, the entire energy of the room shifted. She was loud. She was laughing. She was hugging people she'd only met once before, and she had this electric vibrance that made me feel like I'd been living my life in grayscale. She was the kind of girl who could light up a room just by being in it. And as someone who spends most of his time looking at gray concrete and brown dirt, I was completely mesmerized. We ended up sitting next to each other, and by the time the appetizers were cleared, I was hooked. She was quick, she was confident, and she seemed to genuinely care about what I had to say, even when I was rambling about the logistics of drywall deliveries. It felt perfect. It felt like that movie moment where everything just clicks. But looking back now, I realized that light she brought wasn't warmth. It was a forest fire. It was beautiful from a distance, but the closer you got, the more you realized it was consuming everything in its path. At the start, the intensity was a rush. She'd text me on her lunch breaks, send me these hilarious memes, and act like I was the most interesting man on the planet. I told myself that her occasional sharp comments or her tendency to get a little too defensive were just signs of a strong personality. I mean, nobody's perfect, right? I figured since I was so laid back and chill, I could handle a little fire. I actually liked that she pushed back. It felt like a partnership where we could both grow. We'd go on road trips, stay up late talking about our futures, and it really felt like we were on the same team. I proposed about a year into the relationship on top of Max Patch, this gorgeous spot with 360-degree views of the mountains. It was clear, it was quiet, and when she said yes through her tears, I felt like I'd finally won at life. But the second that ring hit her finger, The forest fire jumped the firebreak. The girl who loved hiking and simple dinners disappeared overnight, replaced by a bridezilla who seemed to have a personal vendetta against my bank account and my peace of mind. The wedding planning didn't start with a conversation. It started with a Pinterest board that looked like the budget of a small European nation. Emma didn't want a celebration of our love. She wanted a production that would make everyone she'd ever gone to high school with jealous. Suddenly, everything I'd spent years building, my savings, my credit, my house, became nothing more than a resource for her vision. It started small, with comments about how my boring house needed a complete makeover before the wedding photos, but it escalated faster than a structural fire in a lumberyard. She found this modern glass venue out in Asheville that cost $14,000 just to lock in the date. When I pointed out that we could buy a whole new truck for that amount of money, she didn't just disagree. She made me feel like I was a cheap, controlling monster for even mentioning a budget. That was the first time I felt that weird shift in my gut. That little voice telling me that the person standing in front of me wasn't the girl I fell in love with. It was the first sign that this wedding wasn't about us anymore. It was about her. Every conversation we had started to feel like a hostage negotiation. If I wanted to talk about our future, I had to pay a ransom in the form of an expensive photographer or a designer lighting package. If I wanted to spend a Saturday afternoon just relaxing with Frodo, I was neglecting the most important day of her life. I was thousands of dollars deep into a wedding that was starting to feel more like a prison sentence, and I was so busy trying to keep the peace that I didn't even notice the smoke filling the room until it was almost too late to get out alive. I was still trying to be the scheduler, still trying to find a way to make the numbers work and keep the project on track. But you can't schedule a disaster out of existence when the disaster is the person you're planning to spend the rest of your life with. Every time I tried to bring us back to reality, she'd turn into this person I didn't recognize, someone cold and dismissive who viewed my concerns as a personal attack. I was becoming a background character in my own life, a guy whose only job was to sign the checks and nod at the right times, while she demolished the life I'd spent a decade building. By the time the deposits were paid and the guest list was finalized, the girl who once danced in my kitchen in her socks was long gone, and in her place was someone who seemed to thrive on the chaos she was creating. It wasn't a wedding anymore. It was a ransom note written in expensive calligraphy, and I was just starting to realize that no matter how much I paid, I was never going to get the old Emma back. I'm the kind of guy who finds peace in the details, because when you spend all day managing 100 different moving parts on a job site, you need a way to turn your brain off when you get home. For me, that's always been my Lego collection. I'm not talking about the little kits for kids. I'm talking about the high-end, complex engineering sets with thousands of pieces that take weeks to assemble. I have this one room in my house that's my absolute sanctuary, filled with floor-to-ceiling custom shelves holding everything from scale models of the Porsche 911 to incredibly detailed modular buildings and Star Wars sets that look more like museum pieces than toys. It's my way of decompressing. There's something about the click of the plastic and the way 1,000 tiny, disorganized pieces eventually become something perfect and structural that just settles my soul. When Emma and I first started dating, she used to tell me it was the cutest thing she'd ever seen. She'd sit on the floor next to me while I worked, nursing a glass of wine and asking me questions about the gear ratios in the car models. She made me feel like my quirks were actually strengths, like she appreciated the patience and focus it took to build something like that. But as the wedding pressure started to climb, that appreciation turned into a weapon. Suddenly, my hobby wasn't cute anymore. It was an immature waste of space that didn't fit into her new, perfect aesthetic for our future together. She started making these little comments about how we'd need to turn my Lego room into a proper guest suite or a lifestyle office that looked good on camera. And when I told her that this room was my retreat, she'd just roll her eyes like I was a child throwing a tantrum. The shift wasn't just about my hobbies, though. It was about the money. In my job, I track every nickel and every hour because that's how projects stay alive. But Emma started treating our finances like a bottomless pit that only existed to serve her vision. We'd be sitting on the couch on a Friday night, and I'd suggest ordering a simple $10 pizza to save a bit of cash, and she would absolutely lose it. She'd go on these rants about how I was diminishing her experience, or how I didn't care about the quality of our life together. But then, literally 20 minutes later, she'd be on the phone with a florist demanding a $3,000 floral arrangement for the ceremony, like it was a basic human necessity on par with oxygen or water. If I even breathed the word budget or asked to see a quote before we signed a contract, her entire demeanor would change in a heartbeat. Her eyes would turn into these flat, cold pieces of glass, and the girl I fell in love with would just vanish, replaced by this stranger who looked at me with pure, unadulterated contempt. It was like I was no longer her partner. I was just a walking ATM that happened to have an opinion she didn't want to hear. The verbal jabs were the worst at first. The constant dripping of, "You're so cheap," or "You have no taste." But then the episodes started. It began with a seating chart argument that escalated so fast I felt like I had whiplash. I suggested moving a few of my college friends to a different table to make room for her family, and she didn't just disagree. She screamed. She screamed until her face turned a terrifying shade of purple, her veins popping out in her neck, and when I tried to walk away to let her cool down, she actually shoved me. It wasn't a huge hit, but it was enough to make me stumble, and the shock of it felt like a bucket of ice water over my head. The next morning, she'd act like nothing had happened. She'd be making coffee and humming a song, and when I'd bring up the fact that she'd put her hands on me, she'd look at me with this wide-eyed, innocent confusion and claim she'd blacked out from the stress. She'd say she didn't remember a single thing I was talking about, and that I was gaslighting her by making up stories about her being aggressive. It was a cycle that started happening more and more often. I'd be walking on eggshells, trying to anticipate her every mood, trying to keep the construction of our relationship from collapsing, while she was actively swinging a wrecking ball at the supports. I kept waiting for the sweet girl from that first dinner to come back, the one who laughed at my jokes and made me feel like I was enough, just as I was. I told myself that she was just overwhelmed by the wedding, that the pressure of the perfect day was just too much for her to handle, and that once the rings were on our fingers, things would go back to normal. But deep down, in that part of my brain that's trained to see structural failure before it happens, I knew the foundation was already gone. She saw my patience and my willingness to forgive as a green light, to see exactly how much she could break before I finally snapped. She was testing the limits of my endurance, pushing further and further into my personal space and my emotional well-being, confident that I would never actually leave because of how much I'd already invested. Every time I forgave a blackout or ignored a cold, glassy stare, I was just teaching her that her behavior had no consequences. I was a professional scheduler who was failing to schedule his own escape, watching the woman I thought was my soulmate turn into a person who took genuine pleasure in seeing me flinch. I felt smaller every day, like I was shrinking to fit into the narrow, expensive, and miserable world she was building for us. And the worst part was that I was still paying for the privilege of my own destruction. I'd look at my Lego sets, these perfectly ordered little worlds, and then I'd look at my actual life, which was becoming a chaotic mess of broken promises and expensive flowers. And I realized that the only thing I was really building was a cage for myself. She didn't want a husband. She wanted a prop that didn't talk back. And she was willing to burn every bridge and break every piece of my happiness to make sure that prop stayed exactly where she wanted it. The physical shoves were becoming more frequent. The blackouts were becoming more convenient for her. And the sweet girl I loved was officially a ghost, replaced by a storm that was only gaining strength. I was still trying to be the anchor, still trying to hold everything down while the wind ripped the roof off our future. But I was starting to realize that an anchor doesn't do much good when the ship is already underwater. Most people think the end of a relationship happens with some big, dramatic speech or a final, tearful goodbye at the airport. But for me, the end didn't happen at the altar or even during a huge blowout in front of our friends. It happened on a random Tuesday afternoon in my home office over something as stupid as a lighting rental. I was sitting at my desk, the same desk where I've spent countless hours meticulously mapping out construction phases and ensuring that every beam and every bolt on a multi-million-dollar project is exactly where it needs to be. I had my budget spreadsheet open, a document that had become my only defense against the rising tide of Emma's insanity. She walked in with her phone glowing, showing me this video of a high-end wedding in California that had this insane LED wall with the couple's initials and a heavy fog machine that made it look like they were dancing on clouds. She told me she'd already called a local vendor and they could do it for only $3,000. But they needed a deposit right now to hold the equipment for our date. I didn't even look up at first. I just pointed at the screen and showed her the line item for the flowers and the venue, explaining as calmly as I possibly could that we were already 20% over our hard cap. I told her we needed to check the spreadsheets and maybe cut something else before we spent another $3,000 on a glorified smoke machine that would be used for exactly 4 minutes of our lives. I wasn't even saying no. I was just saying we needed to be smart. But that was the spark that hit the powder keg. Emma didn't just yell this time. She went straight for the throat. The transformation was instant. That purple tint flooded her face, her jaw locked, and she looked at me like I was an obstacle she needed to clear out of her way. Before I could even stand up, she reached across the desk, grabbed my work laptop, the one with all my active project schedules, my proprietary software, and my entire professional life on it, and she slammed it into the hardwood floor with every ounce of strength she had. I heard the plastic crack and the internal components whine as it hit the ground like a piece of trash. I just sat there, frozen, watching the screen go black. But she wasn't done. She turned her sights on the shelves behind me, the shelves where years of my life were meticulously displayed. She knew exactly what those Lego sets meant to me. She knew about the late nights I'd spent carefully snapping those thousands of pieces together to keep my sanity intact. With one violent, sweeping motion of her arm, she brought down the entire middle shelf. I watched in slow motion as my 1/8 scale supercar and the massive Star Wars flagship I'd spent months on tumbled toward the floor. The sound was something I'll never forget. It wasn't a crash. It was a high-pitched, crystalline shattering of 1,000 tiny plastic dreams hitting the floor and exploding into 1,000,000 disorganized pieces. And the worst part, the part that finally broke the spell she had over me, was that she started laughing. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was a jagged, cruel sound of someone who finally felt powerful because they'd managed to destroy something someone else loved. She looked at the wreckage of my office and then looked me in the eye, waiting for me to scream, waiting for me to chase her or break down in tears so she could call me unstable or immature. But I didn't give her that. I didn't yell. I didn't move a muscle. I just stood there in the sudden, ringing silence of my ruined sanctuary and looked at the woman I was supposed to marry. And for the first time in 2 years, I didn't see Emma. I saw a complete and total stranger, a person so consumed by her own ego and her own need for control that she was willing to smash my livelihood and my peace of mind just to win a petty argument about a fog machine. The silence in that room was heavy, thick with the realization that the foundation of our life together wasn't just cracked. It had been pulverized. Emma must have realized something was different this time because the laughter died out and she started her usual routine of huffing and turning toward the door, probably expecting me to follow her and beg for an apology for making her get that angry. She grabbed her purse and stormed out, slamming the front door so hard the frames rattled. I didn't follow her. I stayed right there, looking at the broken bricks and the dead laptop, and I felt this incredible cold clarity wash over me. It was like a fever had finally broken. I realized that if I married this woman, this wouldn't be an isolated incident. It would be my entire life. I'd be spending the next 40 years trying to rebuild things she'd broken in a fit of pique. I took a deep breath, reached into my pocket, and pulled out my phone. I didn't call her. I didn't text her. I called my lawyer, a guy I'd worked with on several construction disputes, and I told him the wedding was off and I needed to protect my assets immediately. While the phone was ringing, I sat down at my backup computer and started an email. By the time Emma had even made it to her car to drive off and cool down, I had already sent out the cancellation notices to every single wedding vendor we'd booked. I canceled the $14,000 venue, the caterer, the DJ, the photographer, and yes, even the florist. I didn't care about the non-refundable deposits. I just wanted my name off the contracts. I felt like I was dismantling a bomb. With every click and every send button, I was reclaiming a piece of myself that I'd let her take. My heart was pounding, but my hands were steady. I was a scheduler after all, and I was finally scheduling the most important project of my life, my own freedom. I realized that the perfect wedding she wanted was never about us. It was a stage for her performance, and I was just a prop she'd decided to break. As I sat there in the middle of all that shattered plastic, listening to the quiet return to my house, I knew there was no going back. The project was canceled, the site was being cleared, and for the first time in a year, I could actually breathe without feeling like the ceiling was about to cave in. I knew the fallout was going to be nuclear. I knew she was going to try and burn the world down on her way out. But as I watched the sent folder on my email fill up with cancellation confirmations, I didn't feel afraid. I felt like I was finally standing on solid ground again. The woman who laughed while my life shattered was gone, and I was going to make damn sure she stayed gone, no matter what it cost me. I started taking photos of everything: the laptop, the Legos, the scratches on the floor, documenting the debris of a relationship that had finally reached its scheduled end. Emma didn't take the silence well, because for a person like her, silence is the ultimate insult. It means she no longer has a stage to perform on and no audience to manipulate. When she finally realized that the wedding was truly canceled and that I had pulled the plug on every single vendor, she didn't call to apologize. She went straight for the only thing she truly valued, which was her public image. But the real panic set in when she tried to use our joint credit card for a retail therapy session and found out it was frozen solid. I had already moved my half of the savings into a private account and flagged the joint cards for suspicious activity, effectively stripping the queen of her hollow kingdom before she even knew the war had started. She went from being a bride-to-be to a persona non grata in the span of an afternoon, and the explosion that followed was something I had already scheduled in my mind. She hit Instagram with a classic, grainy, black-and-white selfie looking all dejected and teary-eyed, posting a caption that read like a manifesto of victimhood. She told her 3,000 followers that I was a controlling, narcissistic monster who had financially abused her for years and then discarded her like trash just weeks before the wedding. She painted this picture of herself as a brave survivor escaping a gilded cage, and within an hour, my phone was basically a vibrating brick of hate. Her bridesmaids and friends, people I had bought dinner for and treated like family, started flooding my inbox with some of the most vile threats you can imagine. They called me a coward, a pathetic loser who was afraid of a strong woman, and promised me that I would never find peace in this town again. I didn't reply to a single one. I didn't engage. I didn't defend myself. And I didn't leak my side of the story. I just sat in my dark living room with Frodo at my feet, watching the live feeds from my security cameras on my tablet. I knew her better than anyone else did, and I knew that her ego wouldn't let her just walk away with a social media post. She needed a finale. She needed to feel like she had the last word, and I was just waiting for the inevitable moment she'd try to finish what she'd started in my office. The house was quiet. That eerie, heavy quiet you get before a massive storm hits the coast, and I just kept checking the perimeter. I'm a scheduler. I live in the future, and in every version of the future I saw that night, Emma was coming back for blood. Around 2 a.m, the peace of my neighborhood was absolutely shredded by a sound I can only describe as a metallic scream. It was the sound of high-tensile steel being forced into places it wasn't meant to go. I didn't even have to look at the monitor to know what had happened. Emma had taken her heavy SUV and plowed it straight through my garage door at 30 miles an hour. She didn't even try to brake. She just used her vehicle as a 2-ton battering ram. I watched on the high-definition feed as the garage door buckled like a piece of tin foil, the frame groaning and snapping under the impact. The headlights were still cutting through the dust and exhaust as she stumbled out of the driver's side, and even through the thick glass of my front door, I could smell the stench of a distillery wafting off her. She was barely standing, swaying on her feet and screaming at the top of her lungs that I had ruined her life, that I had stolen her future, and that she was going to make sure I paid for every second of her pain. She started grabbing anything she could find in her car: shoes, a makeup bag, a half-empty bottle of wine, and hurling them at my front windows, completely unaware that my doorbell camera and 3 other hidden lenses were catching every single second in crystal-clear detail. She looked like a demon in the glow of the streetlights, her hair matted and her face twisted into a mask of pure, drunken rage. I didn't open the door. I didn't go out to confront her. I just stayed on the line with the 911 dispatcher, calmly giving them my address and explaining that an intoxicated individual was currently destroying my property. It felt like an eternity, but it was probably only 6 minutes before the blue and red lights started bouncing off the trees at the end of the street. When the cops rolled up, Emma didn't even have the sense to stop. She tried to tell them that I was the one who had attacked her, that I had forced her to drive into the garage because I was holding her soul hostage, or some other delusional nonsense. But the officers didn't have to ask many questions. They saw the wreckage of the garage, the trail of destruction she'd left across my lawn, and the very obvious fact that she could barely say her own name without slurring. They did a field sobriety test right there on my driveway, and she failed it so spectacularly she almost fell over on her face. As they were clicking the cuffs onto her wrists, I walked out onto the porch and handed one of the officers a thumb drive containing the footage from the last hour, along with the photos of my office and my forearm from earlier that day. I didn't say a word to her. I didn't even look her in the eye while she was screaming my name from the back of the patrol car. I just watched as they towed her smashed SUV out of my mangled garage door, leaving behind a gaping hole in the front of my house and a permanent record of who she really was. The Queen was finally headed to a cell, and the only thing I could think about as I watched the taillights disappear was how much the repairs were going to cost, and how lucky I was that I'd never have to see her in my bed again. The adrenaline was finally starting to fade, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. She had tried to demolish my world, but all she'd managed to do was provide me with all the evidence I needed to make sure she never got close to me again. I went back inside, locked the door, and for the first time in months, I slept without one eye open, knowing that the demolition phase was finally over and the cleanup was about to begin. Standing in that courtroom a few weeks later felt like finally waking up from a long, suffocating fever dream where the air was made of lead and every step I took was through waist-deep mud. The room was sterile, smelling of old paper and industrial floor wax, a sharp contrast to the chaotic, alcohol-soaked violence of that night in my driveway. I sat there in my best suit, the one I was supposed to wear to a wedding that no longer existed, and I felt surprisingly light. Across the aisle, Emma was putting on the performance of a lifetime. She had ditched the designer heels and the queen attitude for a modest, high-necked sweater and a pair of sensible flats, sitting there with her head bowed like she was some kind of persecuted martyr. Her lawyer, a guy who looked like he'd spent way too much time in tanning beds, started off by playing the emotional distress card. He talked about the immense pressure of wedding planning, the psychological toll of a high-stakes relationship, and how Emma was a sensitive soul who had simply reached a breaking point due to my supposed emotional neglect. He tried to paint me as the cold, calculating scheduler who had treated our love like a construction project, implying that my rigidity had pushed a vulnerable woman to the edge. I just sat there, keeping my face as blank as a fresh sheet of blueprints, because I knew what was coming next. In my world, you don't win an argument with feelings. You win it with documentation, and I had brought the entire library. When it was our turn, my lawyer didn't give a long, winding speech. He didn't need to. He just started laying out the physical reality of who Emma really was. He put the photos up on the big screen for the judge to see, and the room went dead silent. First, there was the high-resolution shot of my forearm from 2 weeks before the breakup. Those 3 jagged, angry red scratches that were still weeping blood when I took the photo. Then came the Lego massacre, as my cousin Damon called it. Seeing those hundreds of hours of my life reduced to a pile of shattered plastic on the office floor made my heart twinge for a second, but it was nothing compared to the next slide. He showed the photo of my work laptop, the screen spiderwebbed and the frame bent, a literal $3,000 piece of equipment turned into a paperweight because I dared to mention a budget. But the real nail in the coffin was the garage footage. We played the doorbell camera video in full 4K glory. You could hear the roar of her engine, the sickening crunch of the metal garage door being folded in half like a piece of notebook paper, and then Emma stumbling out of the wreck, screaming at the sky like a banshee while smelling like a hijacked liquor truck. Her lawyer tried to object, saying it was an isolated incident of temporary insanity, but the judge didn't even blink. He leaned forward, looked over his glasses at Emma, who was now trying to squeeze out some fake tears, and then looked at the itemized list of damages my lawyer had prepared. I had every receipt. $6,200 for the garage door and frame, $2,000 for the specialized laptop and data recovery, $3,500 for the assessed value of the custom Lego builds and the damage to the hardwood floors and shelving. By the time we added in the legal fees and the emergency locksmith, the total was sitting right around $14,000. The judge didn't even hesitate. He granted the restraining order on the spot. 18 months of absolutely no contact, no social media tagging, and a 500-foot buffer zone. Then came the best part. He ordered full restitution. Every single cent of that $14,000 was now a legal debt she owed me, backed by the threat of wage garnishment. I watched the color drain from her face as the reality hit her. There was no more Instagram filters to hide behind, no more blackouts to blame, and no more cheap Nate to pay her bills. She was finally being held accountable for the demolition she'd been carrying out in my life for over a year. When the gavel hit the wood, the sound was better than any wedding bell I could have imagined. I didn't wait around to see her cry for real this time. I didn't look back to see her mom trying to corner my lawyer or her friends whispering in the hallway. I just walked out into the bright afternoon sun, took a deep breath of air that didn't taste like stress, and I didn't stop moving. I went home, packed a single duffel bag, and threw Frodo into the back of my truck. I didn't need a perfect wedding or a glass venue or a $3,000 fog machine to feel like my life was beginning. I had my peace back, and that was worth more than any deposit I'd lost. I'd spent so long scheduling other people's dreams and managing a woman's nightmares that I'd forgotten what it felt like to just exist. I drove for 2 days, watching the flat landscapes of the Carolinas turn into the rolling hills of the Midwest, and finally into the jagged, snow-capped majesty of the Rockies. I booked a one-way ticket to a high-performance driving school in Colorado, the kind of place Emma would have called trashy and immature. I'm sitting in the cockpit of a fully kitted-out Subaru rally car right now, the roll cage tight around me, and the smell of high-octane fuel and hot dirt filling my senses. My instructor is giving me the thumbs up, and I can hear the engine idling, a low, aggressive growl that vibrates right through my chest. For the first time in years, my heart is pounding for the right reasons. There's a dirt track laid out in front of me, a series of sharp turns, unpredictable jumps, and loose gravel that would terrify the old Nate. But the new Nate knows exactly how to handle a crash. I've already lived through the worst wreck of my life, and I'm the one who walked away from the wreckage. I look at the dashboard, seeing the gauges all in the green, and I realize that for once in my life, I'm not worried about the timeline. I'm not worried about the budget, the aesthetic, or the vibe. I'm not scheduling the next 5 years of my life. I'm just scheduling the next 5 seconds. I grip the steering wheel, feeling the texture of the suede under my gloves, and I realize that the $14,000 Emma owes me is just numbers on a page. The real restitution is this moment right here, the silence in my head and the roar of the engine. I'm finally the lead architect of my own happiness, and I'm about to tear this track apart. I shift into first, the gears clicking into place with that same satisfying sound as a Lego brick, and I floor it.